I'm so glad you've tuned into this episode. This is definitely one of my favourite interviews so far. And believe it or not, it's not because my guest is a trombone player. Even though I've sat next to Sasha Romero on stage in performance before, I didn't really know her, and since her egg cracking, which you'll learn about in this episode, I simply had to find time to chat to her. Luckily, we were both at the International Trombone Festival this summer in Salt Lake City, and Sasha was only too willing to meet up for a chat. What a brilliant human being she is, and a wonderful role model. Please welcome Sasha Romero. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. We're at the International Trombone Festival, and I have to say, congratulations on your recital yesterday. It was
Thank you.
Absolutely wonderful.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Can you tell us what you do for a living and where you perform?
Yeah, so I play trombone for a living. You know, I play at the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, first trombone. I'm co-principals with Damien Austin, so we kind of switch off. And then I teach at Rutgers University, Mannes School of Music, Bard College, and now the Manhattan School of Music. Wow. Yeah, I kind of occasionally I'll get gigs outside of that. You know, I do masterclass recitals and universities and stuff, and now I'm here. So
that sounds extremely busy.
It is very busy. I think from February to maybe mid-May this year, I didn't have a single day off. Like, I mean, some days it was lighter. It's like, oh, just 1 or 2 lessons, you know? But it's definitely something I'm trying to work on, is saying no to gigs.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's a musician thing though, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
And I mean, where did it all begin? Where did you, was it a musical upbringing?
Yeah, sort of. It's not exactly the traditional musician's upbringing, but my family was all very musical. My mom was a choral ed major, a soprano. She always got the solos, and so when we did music, she's very adamant that we actually practice. Although she didn't really enforce it, she was just like, well, if you're gonna do it, you might as well like be good at it, right? Yeah. So I have 5 siblings. I'm the third of 6, wow. And we all played brass instruments.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, so I'm the only one who pursued it professionally. But you know, I think one of my earliest memories was sitting in church with a hymnal in my hands, just realizing that I already knew how to read it intervallically. Like once I had the starting pitch, I could just kind of, you know, sing along. And yeah, so I played piano when I was 5 and quit after a year because I got bored. And so, I mean, music has been definitely part of my life since before I can remember. But I didn't start pursuing it seriously until 6th grade, I would say.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah. What age is 6th grade?
11. 11, 12, yeah.
So why the trombone? I mean, it was because of the brass other siblings, or?
Yeah, it was because they had too many trumpet players. I wanted to play trumpet, and they already had too many trumpet players, and so they told me my lips were too big, which was a complete lie. Like, that's not a thing. But yeah, so they told me I could play either trombone or tuba, and my mom said, oh, you're definitely not playing tuba, so trombone it is, and I love it. It's a great instrument. So
it is the best instrument. I always told my lips were too thin for the trombone.
Really?
Yeah, I had to play the trumpet, but
yeah, I think there's a lot of misinformation about brass in general.
Yeah, I totally agree. And if there was a piece of music, if we can play a piece of music right now that sort of that you would say inspired you at that sort of age when you took up the trombone, and why you sort of kind of stuck to the trombone, would there be any music that sort of sticks out to you?
So there's sort of 2 answers to this. One is very stereotypical. It's Bluebells of Scotland. My band director showed me that piece, showed me a Joe Alessi recording actually in 6th grade. And I thought it was awesome. I had no idea the trombone could play any of that stuff. And so he shows me the music and I'm like, wait, are you sure this isn't a trumpet piece? And I sort of hacked away at it. But my reaction to that recording was, oh, wow, he sounds really good. I'm going to beat him. So I was very ambitious and very competitive. I mean, I say was as if I'm not now. But yeah, so I mean, that was kind of my big motivation to practice a lot, was to get really good at Bluebells of Scotland specifically. But the other answer is the planets, and mostly Jupiter and Venus, actually. Because I just really liked it was the 65 Bernstein New York Phil recording. I really just fell in love with that. I would listen to it I would fall asleep to that CD actually,
wow.
You know, and just sort of try to absorb the, not just the trombone stuff, but just sort of the I just thought the way that the music was presented, like it's very much not a perfect like recording. Listening back at it, you know, there's some cracks in the trumpets and there's some weird stuff, but it just felt very like, it was very moving to me. And so that's sort of where I fell in love with like classical music specifically, I think.
Oh, I love that. So that recording specifically, what is it about that version of it? Is it the fact that it sounds kind of real?
I think it's it just sounds more expressive, and it doesn't sound very produced. Like it sounds, it sounds real, I guess. It sounds like people are really trying to like make a statement with it. Like they're trying to display the emotion of the piece more so than I think. Like I feel like my experience with like playing in orchestras is that it can, not that people aren't trying, but it can. It's a rare moment when I think the whole orchestra is actually very inspired.
Yeah.
You know, it can feel a little bit like it's a job at times, and that recording just really strikes me as one of those moments where like the orchestra was really trying. You know.
I love that.
Yeah.
So being a musician, like when the pandemic hit, obviously orchestras, studios, opera orchestras, everything kind of closed. What was it like in the Metropolitan Opera?
Pretty dire, honestly. It was not good times because, well, they stopped paying us. And they're one of the only orchestras that made like top 10 orchestras that didn't pay their musicians anything whatsoever. So, you know, we were living off of savings and unemployment. And so I had to move. I had to like let my lease run out. Had to pack up and move back to Texas and live in Dallas for a bit. And then, you know, when work started back up again, you know, people were just not in a good place. Like a lot of people were not in great places financially. A lot of people had retired at that point, just, you know. And so it's just sort of coming back was really hard because it felt like we all went through some shared trauma, basically.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden we're just back to normal and expected to sort of just be fine. And no one was really fine, you know, especially in New York. Like, you know, the pandemic hit New York pretty hard, you know.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's been getting back to normal. And, you know, I think people are back to their normal slew of complaints instead of pandemic complaints at this point. But, you know, it's something that is still affecting us because this is only we just finished our second season back, you know.
Oh, really? Is that all?
Yeah,
wow.
yeah.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah.
And I mean, I went on your website and I read that sort of around that sort of time, you spoke a bit about your egg cracking.
Oh, yeah.
And I think your website is absolutely wonderful. And I can tell that this is a huge part of your life. Can you tell me sort of as much as you like about it?
Sure. I mean, I think if I tell you as much as I'd like, we'll be here all day. But
okay.
I'll try to tell you the story, I suppose. Yeah. So for anyone who doesn't know, egg crack, like when your egg cracks, it's like trans terminology for when you realize that you're trans, basically. But it's a very playful, sort of loose category. You know, it's not exactly the same thing as denial because, say, like for in my case, and in a lot of trans people's cases, growing up, say, in a place like Texas, in Longview, Texas, which is very conservative, very Christian, not very LGBTQ accepting. I didn't even have the terminology really to understand what I was going through as a kid. So in some ways, I would say, quote unquote, my egg cracked back when I was 5, when I was first like, oh, I would rather be a girl. That's sort of when that realization happened for me. It was very early into my life, but I didn't understand what that meant or that was an actionable sort of, you know, identity or desire or whatever you want to call it, you know?
Yeah, of course.
And so it took until right before my, I think it was right before my 29th birthday where my egg officially cracked, which is to say that I sort of realized, oh, this is a thing. This is not usual. You know, this is not the usual kind of like sort of I had an explanation for like a lot of things in my life that sort of just it didn't make sense to me, and I explained it away as other various things like, oh, maybe I'm just depressed, or oh, maybe I'm just tired, or oh, maybe I'm just bad at being a guy, basically. So yeah, like realizing that I was trans represented sort of a lot of puzzle pieces in my life coming together and making sense in a way that like really felt good. I mean, even before like I started transitioning or came out to anyone, it just sort of, it just meant I had some answers for things in my life that didn't really have answers before that point. Yeah, as far as like what actually did it, it's sort of, it sounds silly, but I think it makes a lot of sense and it's not that unusual. I basically just came into contact with trans people more online. Initially through, like I'd actually amassed quite a repertoire of like trans friends at that point, trans and non-binary friends. And one of them had even asked me at one point, like, are you sure that you're cis? Are you sure you're not like non-binary or something? And I was like, no, of course I'm, you know, definitely, I mean, you know, but so like that was like a year or so before I actually realized that they were onto something. And, but yeah, so like being in contact with like the trans community, both in my personal life and online, and just sort of realizing that like I had never really heard the trans experience as expressed by an actual trans person. I realized that the story that a lot of people hear that I had heard is very far from what like the reality is for a lot of people, and doesn't really capture the essence of what it means to be trans. It's both more complicated and a lot simpler than people think. And I can try to explain it, but at this point we're getting into sort of,
please do.
I guess contested philosophical territory. But you know, for me, I would say what it was, there were a couple of big realizations that I didn't have before, was just that a lot of trans people don't actually just know that they're trans from an early age. That's the story you hear is, you know, oh, you know, Wendy realizes she's a boy or a girl or whatever, you know, and like, and you know, like from like the age of 3 or something, and like cross-dressing, and it's a whole package that people think of, I think, you know. And as it turns out, a lot of people grow up in environments like me where you're just not given access to the information you need to sort of make sense of what's going on with you. And so a lot of people realize a lot later, once they're sort of in their adulthood and they have more freedom, more access to information, more safety is a big one.
Yeah.
And so for me, being in the pandemic, mostly by myself, with no one to like sort of judge me basically, or like, you know, like I was a lot more free to access that information in a way that felt safe.
Yeah.
And I just realized very quickly that like I vibed with it, basically, that like it really made a lot of sense to me, and that the things like I don't know if you've ever had the experience of just like reading someone else's writing and feeling like they must be inside your head, you know?
Yeah.
Like, and it really felt like that.
Amazing.
Yeah. So once I realized that like, okay, so this community and I share a lot in common with like some very, very deep thoughts that go back a long time in my life that I've never really even acknowledged because there's really nothing to do with them.
Yeah.
You know? And so once that happened, my egg cracked and I was like, oh, well, I guess I'm trans. And it wasn't really that hard of it took like maybe a week for me to come to that conclusion after sort of the damn burst of me realizing that this is like a community I had stuff in common with, you know? And it took a long time after that to start transitioning, and then it took, you know, even longer to like come out publicly. But you know, not that long in the grand scheme of things. You know, from the time when my egg cracked to like being public was about 1.5 years. So
wow.
Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Sorry.
It's amazing.
Like I'm rambling.
This is brilliant.
Yeah.
I'd love to delve more into this. And can you explain to anyone listening who might not know the difference between trans? I mean, there's trans, there's transgender, there's transsexual, there's
non-binary.
And non-binary.
Yeah.
Can you explain the difference?
There's also agender, there's asexual, you know, that kind of stuff. So yeah, no, for sure. So transgender is sort of transsexual is sort of an outdated term, and so most people would use transgender now. Although, like, in the trans community, it's more or less seen as interchangeable. Like, transsexual isn't exactly seen as offensive necessarily, but it's outdated, and it's the same way, like, transvestite used to be what you would call a crossdresser. Now we just call them crossdressers, you know? And so transgender, the change in terminology was mostly because it used to be that you weren't really considered to be what we would call transgender now unless you did medical transition. And so the thinking has moved on to gender and sex being two completely different things. And so you can be of one gender and your sex does not necessarily have to match. And so it's a more inclusive way to sort of describe the phenomenon that people experience of their gender not aligning with what they were assigned at birth. And also, it's not exactly the same thing as your gender being different from your sex. And even with like just transgender people, let alone non-binary people, which I'll get to in a sec. It's sort of complicated because, like, there are intersex people in the trans community, and so some people get assigned something at birth that they, it can be hard to define exactly, which is why like exactly what your sex is for some people, and a lot of people don't even know that they're intersex. You can even be like multiply sexed with chimerism, which is where, like, say, for two fraternal twins, one absorbs the other, so you could have XX and XY DNA in the same person. So you can literally have like a male brain and a female body, or vice versa, right? The prevalence of that is unknown, but twins are not that uncommon, and chimerism is extremely common in, say, like dogs and cats and stuff like that. So it's probably actually pretty common that's a phenomenon in people. So non-binary people, though, it's under the trans umbrella for the most part, but some non-binary people don't consider themselves to be trans. It's complicated, but the simple way of putting it is that non-binary people simply don't consider their gender to be in the categories of male or female. They might consider themselves to be sort of in the middle somewhere on a spectrum. Really masculine or feminine might be a better terminology to describe it. So somewhere in the middle, or some people might describe their gender as being more aligned, not with what we consider to be masculine or feminine traits, but with something else. Or they might be bigender or gender fluid, and so just not fit into the binary categories for that reason. But it's sort of a catch-all term for just people who don't fit into the binary, essentially, in their understanding of their gender. And a lot of people hear that and think that doesn't make any sense. But I think one way to sort of think of it is just to think of the binary of masculine and feminine sort of genders, and to think about how they have differed throughout time. Because the experience one would have of being a man or a woman in, say, the early, Middle Ages in the 1400s or something would be entirely different from one's experience of being a man or woman today. And the expectations one would have, the gender roles you might play, the way that basically feels to be a man or a woman would be fairly different. And although there is continuity between, say, a woman back then and a woman now, you can trace a historical path through it, the experience of that gender is going to have been different. And it's different even for people in different cultures today. It's really different between each individual person, but there's enough in common to where we can sort of have a shared language to describe it. And that might not be the case depending on the culture or the time period. And so non-binary people might have a feminine or masculine gender, but they don't think it aligns with our current experience of masculine or feminine genders. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense, totally. Just quickly, before we get back to the episode, I just want to say that if you're enjoying this podcast so far, then there is one little thing that you can do to help the show, and that's just to hit the follow button. It doesn't cost anything, but it would mean the world to me. Thank you. Now let's get back to Sasha. So when you say about sort of not being sort of comfortable with your gender that you're assigned with at birth, is it kind of like feeling as though you were born into the wrong body?
It can express itself that way, but I think a lot of trans people are moving away from that description of it because it sort of makes it feel as if it gives the impression that, say, my body doesn't really belong to me, that I am not inhabiting it, and it's sort of close, but I would say. This is sort of on the subject of gender dysphoria, which is another hotly debated term. Like I said, I could talk about this forever, but
I love it. It's brilliant.
So gender dysphoria basically is it's not actually unique to the trans experience, although it's usually somewhat definitional to it. It's basically just the experience of some part of your body or the way you express yourself not aligning with how you feel internally, basically, your sense of gender internally. And so cis people can get that, as well. Pretty much any guy who has gone through balding and doesn't like that and takes Rogaine, that's gender dysphoria, right? Or, women who, like get like, you know, breast augmentations or something, you know, like anything that basically helps you affirm your gender identity outwardly. Is a gender, you know, cis people get gender affirming procedures all the time, and trans people do too. And actually every single trans affirming procedure that has been invented, every surgery and medicine and everything was actually designed for cis people first, which is not a fact most people know.
Wow.
Like even puberty blockers for, like, say, children who just undergo puberty too early, right?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So you know, knowing that fact, it's really obvious that the hullabaloo around trans healthcare has nothing to do with the safety of it at all. It has to do with just hating trans people. And I'm getting a little off topic,
Wow,
but
no, that's important.
Yeah, but as far as like not feeling like you're in the right body, I think on a very simple level that can be true for a lot of trans people. But I don't think it really captures it entirely.
I feel like it could actually be kind of rude as well. Saying that kind of thing.
It can be. I would say I think a better way to put it might be less that trans people feel like, and again, not to speak for everyone, but like I'll just speak for myself. Like, it's less that I feel like I'm in the wrong body and more that the body I have, while I do like some parts of it, like the fact that it keeps me alive, you know, it doesn't really express what or people don't see in it. At least, you know, say, especially before transitioning. So this is becoming less and less the case, but people didn't see me as the way I saw myself.
Right, yeah.
In a vacuum, if like there were no other people in the world, I'm guessing that that I would experience less, say, gender dysphoria, and a lot of trans people would experience less gender dysphoria because it's almost more about the reflection of how other people see you as opposed to specifically, I hate my body, you know,
Yeah.
Again, I'm going to get a lot of pushback probably from trans people specifically on that particular statement. Because it can be, like I said, gender dysphoria can be very definitional of an experience for being trans. So some people would align with that statement, you know.
But everyone's going to experience it completely differently as well.
Yeah. So the more my body aligns with how people perceive women, and the more I'm treated that way, the more that it's not really about other people, but it's hard to you know, delineate the difference between like what feels good internally versus what doesn't. So like, you know, like if I look at myself in the mirror, it's really hard to delineate what parts I like or don't like from a vacuum. And I think that's actually it really doesn't match like the American individualistic kind of way we think about ourselves. We think of ourselves in this Rene Descartes way, which is I think, therefore I am, as if we're completely isolated, as if our ideas of ourselves are completely isolated from anyone else.
Yeah.
But I don't really think that's true. We're very social creatures. And Audre Lorde, who's a New York poet and philosopher, and described herself as a fat, black, gay communist woman, in her book, Zami, A New Name for Myself. She lived in the 1920s and 30s. And the way she put it is that we can't really see ourselves except as reflections in other people. And the example isn't the one that she gave, but one that I sort of came up with based on reading that is like, say, for example, you know, I like trombone. I like to play trombone. I like other instruments, you know. But I wouldn't know that I like trombone if I didn't see other people playing trombone. Because on some level, like, you know, I'm not going to walk up to a trombone out in the wild. Someone had to make it, right?
Yeah.
And more than likely, my first experience of it is with people. It's a social experience, right? So if trombone was never invented, or if I was never around people who played it, I probably wouldn't realize I like that.
Yeah.
So my identity as a trombonist, as a musician, is I had to sort of see that identity in other people first, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So to me, like, I think that's sort of why I'm in the wrong body. It just doesn't quite capture it because, you know, this goes to the subject of passing, which is another big term in the trans community, which is just to say people see me as the gender that I would like for them to see me as, right? And that's a big reason why people will do medical transition, is to outwardly make sure that they are treated the way they want to be treated, and so that when they look in the mirror, they see what they want to see, right? I say we, you know. But I think in a much more trans-accepting society, that did treat people as the gender they are, regardless. Like if we were able to untrain ourselves from like immediately assuming a lot about a person just based on their looks, or if we even were to like just reconstruct how we think of gender in the first place as a society and how we do gender roles, or like if we could do that, then I would imagine a lot of trans people would feel a lot less of a need to do medical transition as urgently. It might still be a thing people do for their own sake, but I think a large part of it is so that we can be treated as the people who we feel like, basically the gender we feel like, because to not have that is an experience that most cis people will never have, and it is pretty hard. It's not something that I would wish on anyone, because it feels a lot like being out at sea without a boat. Because you're expected to have the boat, you're expected to have the equipment you need to be the gender you're expected to be, and you just don't. So every day is just a struggle to sort of just keep your head above the water.
I know on your website you said something like about being in character and having to stay in character for such a long time. I mean, how old are you now? Do you mind me asking?
Sorry, yeah. What was that?
How old are you now? Do you mind
I'm
asking?
31. Yeah,
31 now. And aged 5, you knew there was something, and you said you were like
29.
29.
Yeah.
That was when your egg cracked.
Yes.
So all this time, you said on your website you felt like you was kind of playing a character.
Yeah, and it's a character that you don't realize you're playing too, and that's another hard part of it.
Wow.
And I mean, some trans people do know from an early age and sort of repress it in a different way, which is to ignore it, just like push that away, because again, it's not safe to be trans in a lot of places.
Yeah.
It definitely, I would say my experience of it was a bit like I said, what I thought it was for most of my life was just, I'm bad at being a guy. And which was true. But that's not really the cause of that. And I did try really hard to sort of fit in, but it just never really worked. When I would try to do the sports hang, and I try to say a sportsy thing or say a joke in the same ways, just trying to imitate, what I heard. Yeah. I don't know if you've had the experience of someone say who, this is a weird example, but someone who's really religious, who's trying to use a cuss word and they never cuss, basically. And it's you can just tell they don't really know how to use it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I got the impression that's what everyone thought every time I would try to
bless you,
do the guy thing. And so it was really obvious that I didn't fit in, and I did, and also it results in ostracization. So, just not fitting in anywhere, and also being mixed race and neurodivergent. And so all of that resulted in a lot of ostracization, which is the biggest, kind of downside of it, basically. Because like I said, we're social creatures. We all want to be accepted. We all want to have a group that we can feel like we fit into. And when you don't fit in anywhere, it's pretty hard.
And did you feel that you had people around you that you could sort of confide in at all around this time? And also I want to ask, what was the process like? I mean, coming out, and how did you decide when, and did you have people around you that you could confide in around that time? Yeah,
I mean, by the time I cracked, yes, I had lots, like I said, I had lots of trans friends that I could definitely talk to. I had lots of queer friends in general at that point.
And was this sort of through the pandemic, through the internet?
No, this was in person, actually. Just
Brilliant.
Friends of friends, and queer people tend to stick together. Actually, there's a joke that's if you have 5 straight friends and 1 gay friends in a group, 5 of them will be gay by the end of the year, and 1 will still be straight or something.
I love that.
Yeah, it's just the gaydar is a real thing. There actually are studies about it. You just people, whether you're queer or not. It's just, I think there's just something where it's sort of something clicks. You're like, oh, I know I get along with this person.
Yeah.
I had people in my life, which is extremely helpful. My current partner was in my life before I came out, and Jen Hinkle, she really helped with everything. And coming, when I decided to come out, it was sort of more or less was according to plan, sort of, kinda, except I had to accelerate it because someone in my life outed me, and the word got out pretty quickly after that, and I confirmed that. And so I had to come out. I was going to come out in August of 2021, and I moved that up to May just to sort of nip that in the bud.
Wow.
which sucked a lot, honestly, but it is what it is. And I was definitely at least happy to not have to like, to get it over with, essentially, because coming out is hard, but it's not like, once the initial shock was over with, it's like, okay, I'm still me, people have been sort of getting the hang of it,
And
so, yeah.
I mean, I remember, when I was diagnosed with cancer, and it's a completely different story, but my first ever chemotherapy nurse said, you'll find out who your friends are. And she was completely right. I thought it was just so corny thing to say, but was that a case there with someone outing you? Do you find out who your friends are?
You do, yeah. It's really unfortunate that, we have, some people are just fair weather friends, and others are ride or die, and I thankfully had a good amount of ride or die friends. But yeah, it's been hard because definitely, like, since coming out, I found out who is really comfortable and who is kind of in the middle and who definitely isn't. And I've been lucky enough to not really have experienced a lot of really overt discrimination, being in New York and being in a liberal arts institution and having lots of protections, and the music industry is theoretically fairly liberal. I tend to find there's some NIMBYism that goes on there, not in my bathroom, basically, but people in the Met have been fairly good about it. And,
I was going to ask, actually, how were they in the orchestra?
Yeah, it's been okay. It's not been perfect. There have been definitely some moments that, like I mentioned earlier, the biggest thing that I think people don't realize is a form of discrimination is just ostracization. So people who used to invite me to things who don't invite me to things anymore, or not as often, and they probably, I'm guessing, don't even realize that they're doing it. Because that's what implicit bias is, or unconscious bias. You just don't realize that. Now, like, maybe it's you just didn't realize you don't really want to go be seen in public with a trans person. And what's really interesting is that my lived experience, like, outside of the Met, outside of where people know that I'm trans, is that people treat me like a woman. Like, I pass relatively well, even at this relatively early stage of my transition, and that's only going to become more and more the case, basically. But at work, I get the sense that people sort of have a hard time accepting or they don't see the physical changes that have happened, and they also maybe don't philosophically accept that I am a quote-unquote real woman, and so they have to put me in some other category, and thus they don't treat me like a woman.
So I guess it's people that have known you for a long time then.
Yes. Yeah, that's who has the issues, which is really interesting and really unfortunate. But like I said, it's not like, I don't think anyone, thankfully, is really intending to be like transphobic or have that kind of bias. But it is something that I wish, people were more aware of, or that people would just ask more questions, Like I've been approached by a lot of people with like trans kids or trans students, and they'll ask me these questions, and I'm like, yeah, that's a good thing to ask. That's a good thing that I wish more people knew about. And it's not a big deal, like, really at all. As long as you ask respectfully, and like, it's not like something super personal that's no one's business, But like, it's unfortunate because I think people are just they're afraid that I'll like get mad, or that like, that I'm that I'll go social justice warrior on them or something, and like, I don't know, like throw blue hair dye at them. Like it's really just honestly kind of darkly hilarious to me, because I'm like, y'all knew me before. That I be talking, and like I'm like not someone who tends to like yell at people like in a very, even when I'm like been directly attacked, like I don't really spend a whole lot of my time like calling out people and being like, this person's awful and how dare, I'm just like, okay, don't do this, please,
Yeah.
Like, I don't know.
Yeah, no,
so
exactly.
it's like I transition and suddenly people think I'm an entirely different person, or they think I'm some stereotype in their head,
Yeah.
So
one of my questions was going to be, have you received sort of unwanted attention, and how have you handled it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Very, very much yes. Since even before I came out, like I wasn't really dressing up in girl mode very much, but when I did, like I would get catcalled all the time. It's pretty much a nightly experience for me in New York. I've been followed a couple times, and that's always scary. And like even at work, like I'm obviously not going to name any names, but there's a couple of guys who have given me some a little more attention, and interest in getting to know me in ways that are not exactly like harassment or anything, but it's just like, it's very much like, I mean, that's just like, just being a woman, basically, which is, it's sort of both affirming and also kind of like, okay, all right, like, all right, bye, nice to meet you.
And they knew you, they've known you for a long time as well.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I'm not sure this particular person or people, like, so like, it's been like a couple people, but really just, anyway, it's like, I don't want to like talk about the drama there too much, but it's just like, it's just been interesting to have that shift.
Yeah.
But like, it's hard to tell sometimes whether someone's like, I get stared at a lot actually, and it's hard to tell whether that's just like, people staring at me because they think I'm pretty, or if they think they're not sure if I'm like trans or something.
But also like, wow, how great as well. That could be a kind of stare as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember, again, different story completely, but when I lost my hair, my hair 3 times going through cancer. And when you're out and about and you've lost your hair, that's the time when you feel absolutely fantastic because you are out. You're not in a hospital bed. You're not sick at home. You're out and about. But people stare at you and go, that's a cancer patient. And you're like, you don't want to be stared at right then because you're out and you're getting on with it.
Yeah. It definitely, I think it can be similar, especially like, like for people who like, I've definitely gotten the I can't, like, like when people like go to gender me, they're like, how are you? And again, it's getting less and less the case as I keep transitioning, but especially like, say like 6 months ago or something.
But I guess it's always from, I don't know, when this all sort of started, it's just going to keep getting better and better and better, surely, because society is moving on.
Ideally, I mean,
we hope.
We would hope. There's definitely, I personally think this recent transphobic push is the last gasps of a dying dinosaur kind of institutional way of thinking, because it is institutions that are keeping transphobia alive. In a vacuum, before the cultural zeitgeist, people didn't really think about trans people at all. It was like sometimes, we were the butt of a joke, and it's not like it was good. It really was not. Like things are better now, but I think we're way more publicly in the cultural zeitgeist. Yeah. And so that's a good and a bad thing, because like for people who are transphobic and want to discriminate against trans people, the fact that like more people know sort of that trans people exist and they're looking out for it, both cis and trans people are going to get kicked out of bathrooms and beaten up, and like there's stories about like say a trans man who went into the women's restroom and who got beat up because some guys thought that he was a trans woman, and there's cis people who have gotten beaten up or kicked out, because they were butch, or they just looked, it's just like, it's just people. I mean, the whole "you can always tell" thing is really, really, really not true. It's also confirmation bias, because you would only be able to tell for probably like what they're probably actually like seeing are like drag queens a lot of times. Who are not trying to pass, like it's a very specific look. And also most of them are guys, like, that's their gender. Yeah. Versus like a lot of trans people who a lot of times are trying to pass. And even if for people who like, say if you know a lot about trans people, you might be able to sort of tell more that someone is trans. But even for like my level of knowledge about like, say, some of the more telltale signs, even I, like, sometimes someone will come up to me and they'll reveal to me that they're trans, like, a couple hours into our interaction, it's like, I had no idea, right? Yeah. And so people really can't always tell, because that's not how sex works. It's not how gender works either. And people just really have a very poor understanding of basic biology, let alone advanced biology, Yeah. So, because we're actually not that different in terms of like our physiology. We're like, I think overall, on average, like the difference between like male and female as a category, as on average, like obviously individuals can be very different, but on average, it's like 7 to 10% difference, in like stuff like height or, jaw width or whatever it is, so it's like, that's not that big, so.
Yeah, no, totally.
Yeah.
And I want to come back to music, and I'd love to be able to play another track of music now.
Sure.
Is there anything... I don't know, thinking about like the power of music, and did music help you during all this huge part of your life, or is there any tracks that you would just gravitate towards during these times?
I really fell in love with Phoebe Bridgers during the pandemic. And yeah, Phoebe, if you're listening, you know, at me, you know. Yeah, no, yeah, I mean, it was sort of a dark period of my life for several reasons, you know. It's like loss of social, like, you know, connection, loss of a job and financial instability. And then all of a sudden I have this gender crisis to deal with. And I mean, you know, that part was actually a very big positive for me because it's like, oh, I finally figured something major out in my life and this is going to make me happier. And that was, even though it's like been extremely hard to do all this and it's been hard to go through a lot of it, that was a big moment in my life. But as far as music, sorry.
No, do you feel as though the pandemic sort of helped you get to this?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's
so many.
Great. Because you can get some real positives out of a pandemic, and that's obviously one for you.
Yeah, no, I think it's sort of a stereotype at this point. Like, there's like a stereotype of pandemic babies and like the queer community at large, like not just trans people, just because so many people finally got away from social institutions that, you know. Yeah. I mean, that's also, it's a really big tell that like transphobia and queerphobia is still very present in a lot of institutions, even if we have made a lot of progress, because the fact that when people finally have time to themselves, they figure this shit out is really telling, you know. But yeah, as far as specific music, I listened to Phoebe Bridgers' song Kyoto a lot, and Garden Song, and I also got into a couple of other artists, Snail Mail, who else? I don't know, just like basically indie folk, kind of indie rock, and just sort of melancholy, sad girl vibe.
No, it's perfect. Yeah. Isn't it? I think it's always funny, the kind of music we sort of gravitate towards in certain times of our life. Can you tell us about the Kyoto track?
Yeah, it's that track is, I believe, about her dad and their pretty bad relationship. And it's basically her talking about being on tour and getting a call from her dad, and just sort of being annoyed because it's like too little too late in their relationship. And apparently they did make up after this song specifically, so it had a positive outcome. But yeah, it's just a really fun song, and it's sort of, yeah, it's just like a vent. It's just a frustration vent, and like just like, I'm on tour and my dad called and that this sucks, basically, you know. And I don't know, it's like, it wasn't really directly tied to anything in my life, but the vibe was just like, I don't know, it just really spoke to me for some reason.
Yeah, cool.
Like, I often listen to music without really hearing the lyrics first, and so it's a lot more about just the way it sounds to me, you know?
I wonder if that's like a musician thing, because we play the melodies, the harmonies and things, I don't know.
It might be, yeah.
Wonderful. We'll have a listen to that now.
Yeah.
And when you talk about sort of the transphobic people, would you say that's kind of an old-fashioned way of looking things? And do you think that is something that is likely to get better and better over time?
Yeah, I mean, transphobia is definitely, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I actually don't know if I would call it old-fashioned. I actually feel like the way that it presents itself today is actually relatively new in the grand scheme of human history. Basically, since like the 1700s or so, with like the Victorian era, and also like, you know, the Puritans in America, they've influenced culture to be a lot, like Western culture, to be a lot more prudish, to be a lot more patriarchal in a very specific Judeo-Christian way, and a lot more gender roles were very, very strict and codified in this particular way. With male domination, patriarchal domination, and not that doesn't exist in other cultures, but the very particular way it was solidified really, I think, feeds into a lot of transphobia, because there's ideas in this Western way of thinking about gender and sex that have not been present in a lot of other societies. Like, say, for example, like Western way is like, okay, I mean, we all know it's like the binary. You have men, women, and that's immutable and you can never change. Like, there's it comes from this idea of like some sort of essence in your soul that is immutable. And so, and people might not think of it that way, but that's where the idea comes from, you know? But like in other cultures, like, you know, say, and not to speak for cultures that I'm not a part of, but just my knowledge of this is that, you know, so like the 2S in the LGBTQIA 2S plus acronym is, two-spirit people from Native American tribes. And it's, my understanding is that it's really a political way of sort of advocating for the rights of a lot of different traditions of third gender, fourth gender people. And they don't think of it as the same way as we think of trans people. And this gets into a whole complicated topic about like why, like what exactly a social construct is. And we don't have time for that, I'm sure. But
we need a second episode.
Yeah, yeah, we need like several hours of just video essays for this. But the point is, like, so there's that. There's like apparently ancient Judaism had like something like 6 or 8 genders in the Talmud that they talk about to describe, like eunuchs versus women in a male body, men in a female body. Like they had trans people directly in these genders basically, and a lot of like they had genders to describe intersex people and blah blah blah. So and then the Greeks. Sort of like ancient Greece sort of had one sex but 2 genders because they thought of women as just sort of like underdeveloped men or something,
Oh my God.
like malformed men, male. So it's like we're the same. So in a way, it's actually more accurate because we develop sort of neutral in the womb, and then testosterone kicks in, and you develop more masculine traits. But our neutral is much more close to like the female body, basically, which is interesting. So they were sort of onto it that beforehand, which I don't know. It's But so as far as it being old-fashioned, it is in a sense like for what Western culture is, which is still relatively new, I think, in its So, but I think it will get better. I think it is getting better. Yeah.
What do you think society can do in terms of helping to get better?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest thing. Yeah, it's even hard to pick just one thing, but like, so there's a couple things. One is education basically, and just sort of not just like knowing about trans people, but valuing like there's an idea that I heard about that is, I forget the technical term for it, but it's the way that bias often enforces ignorance is less because people don't want to learn, but more because actually of not valuing the people that you are learning about as much as you think you do. So for example, say in a fully white community that's been white for a long time, that's like very gentrified, and like there may be institutional like reasons for why it's not mixed race, right? So people in that community who have never really lived anywhere besides other people who are like them probably don't, a lot of them might not even know that they should that they're missing out on other people of different cultures that might enrich their lives in ways that are meaningful. So that kind of bias, it's like you just won't be motivated to learn about, say, trans people if you don't really think that trans people have anything valuable to add to your life in particular. Like, and it doesn't have to be like in person, it can be like, say, a trans celebrity, or just like maybe you're just sort of apathetic to trans politics because again, it just you don't really see how it affects you essentially, but we all affect each other, and trans people in particular can sort of be anyone anywhere because there's still a lot of people who are in the closet. And until society is much safer to come out, that's going to keep being the case. So a lot of times it's actually, you should care because maybe your child is trans, or your coworker, or your partner even, right? So I think people just like basically seeing the immediacy of why you should want to learn things, let alone just actually knowing things. Because I didn't know a lot about the trans community until it sort of affected me, which I hate that, because I had trans friends, and I just realized there's so many things I just didn't bother to ask them about their own experience, And then the other big thing would just be just continuing to fight patriarchal ideas and norms and institutional ways that gender and gender roles are enforced. Because until it's normal to have, say, like Ruth Bader, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, until it's normal to have 9 women on the Supreme Court, as normal as it's been to have 9 men, or until it's as normal to like sort of not presume heteronormativity or cisnormativity, if when we can sort of like say that we've destroyed those norms and we have implemented just more openness, more curiosity about people's individual experiences rather than putting people into boxes and assuming that we know things about people simply because we think they're in some gender box or some class box or race box, right? If we can do all that, I think that's obviously going to help because transphobia is very intersectional. It is very influenced by ableism, especially actually, and racism and classism, but with ableism, it's influenced by that a lot because of actually it has big overlap with like mental health and people's lack of understanding or acceptance of it, because it's the whole, well, of course you'd say you're not crazy because a crazy person wouldn't know they're crazy. I'm sure you've heard that idea, which apparently wasn't really a popularized idea until I think the 80s or 90s or something. But a lot of people will look at me and assume that there must be something wrong with my brain because it's been described as a mental illness before. And therefore, there's a lot of like, people assume that trans people don't have agency in their own lives to decide our own futures, to decide our own paths, or that we can't advocate for ourselves, or that they know more about our own experience of our gender than we do. It's a very colonialist idea. It's totally right in line with the whole, oh, we need to like travel to your land and take over your country for your benefit because you need Jesus. Like it's exactly that mindset, and people don't realize it, you know? And then with racism, it's just, that's sort of, I have to go more into history for that. But just I say all that just to say that like, transphobia is sort of like, it is something obviously that needs to be tackled directly. But I don't think it's I think you sort of have to you have to want to tackle all of it. You have to want to be very progressive, I think, to really get rid of all of the little transphobic biases in your head, Yeah. So, yeah.
And I mean, on the subject of mental health, how would you say that your mental health has changed maybe over the years? I mean, when you say about sort of having to play a character, how is your mental health, what was it like then to now?
Yeah. So my mental health, pretty much it's almost straight line from like, bad to good, essentially over the course of my life. And, obviously ups and downs. And I would never have described myself as like extremely depressed or something like that. But like dead inside, kind of numb, just sort of going through the motions. Definitely that was like a lot of my life. So when I was like a really young kid, I felt more or less fine. I thought I had a decent childhood. And then pretty much once I got to elementary school and I realized, oh, I would much rather be a girl, because it's sort of the first time that gender matters, I think, is because that's when kids really start developing a stronger sense of gender identity and they start noticing gender roles and start enforcing them within each other. So once that happened, it was sort of downhill. Once puberty hit, I was I wasn't super depressed, but I was depressed. I was definitely not having a good time. I started to get bullied more during that time because, again, kids are mean to each other if you don't fit the stereotypes of the boxes that you're supposed to be in. But the biggest thing is just like loneliness, because of a confluence of things of just being neurodivergent, being an introvert, being queer, not knowing it, just not really being mixed race. Also, I sort of like didn't fit into the category of black or white, and so in Longview especially, like those categories were very stratified. It was a very sort of segregated social dynamic.
I was going to ask, have there been things you've had to overcome there as well?
Oh yeah. I mean, the way I sort of overcame all that initially, and I sort of started to improve my mental health, was to sort of just develop my skills to where I wanted to be so good. Like my game plan really, like consciously, was to be so good at what I did that people couldn't help but respect me, and therefore they would like spend time with me. And like, and it's kind of sad because really what that boils down to is the belief that I didn't have inherent self-worth, or that other people would never see it. And so I had to do things for people instead of just being someone worth hanging out with. Yeah. And so that underlying idea is definitely something I've had to work on.
I feel like you're putting pressure on yourself in a way.
Yeah. But, I started playing trombone, and I was in a metal band in high school. And then when I got to college, I sort of tried to just develop more of a fuck you attitude, sort of, just sort of like a, I'm going to do what I want kind of attitude. And that really started to work for me because, as it turns out, people respect self-confidence, even though it was a little bit faked, you know. I just sort of, once I sort of started developing that skill set, my social life started improving, and I got better at the trombone. And when people respect you, they tend to be nice to you. And, it's a little bit, but because of that very conscious, like, realization of how that social dynamic works of, say the power you gain through like say being good at your instrument or something, because I'm good at my instrument, it's hard sometimes to know, at the back of my head, there's always this like nugget of sort of like knowledge that like if I wasn't as good at my instrument as I am, if I hadn't achieved the things I've achieved, then a lot of these people would not be treating me as well as they do. And I know that because when other trans people talk to me about how they're treated, it's usually not as good as I am treated, So I basically sort of, to answer your question, I mean, I sort of overcame a lot of my social struggles and a lot of the gender dysphoria I dealt with just by, just being good at what I do, and
But I guess that's kind of a focus as well at the time.
Yeah.
Nice to have a focus, I guess.
It was. No, I definitely did a lot of escapism and a lot of, I spent a lot of time practicing and a lot of time competing and playing video games and doing other hobbies. I skateboarded and, I did pretty much anything I could do to avoid just sitting in my own thoughts and like just experiencing what it felt like to be me. Yeah. And actually that ended up being really a detriment because once my egg cracked, I sort of couldn't do that anymore. I had to just sit there and face my own, like the reality of my own head, and the pandemic too did not help. And like I said, it all ended up being a positive, but it was really hard once I realized I was trans to sort of be vulnerable and to sort of open myself up as being, this is actually me. This is, and sort of trying to be willing to come up to people like you either will like appreciate me just for who I am or you won't, basically. Whereas I had sort of forced it, with the whole like playing well to get respect thing. So I basically didn't have any coping mechanisms to deal with like rejection anymore. So it started like, it felt like I went all the way back to like middle school again. And I had to relearn how to just be social, in like ways that are healthier, that aren't as sort of hiding behind a character, as and so that was really hard. That was sort of, I mean, it still is something I'm sort of doing, but like after I came out like last May or May before last, and getting back into the season after the summer, it was a lot to manage, let alone people sort of as an adult expect you to know a lot of things about living as a woman that you just just haven't had an opportunity to learn. And I'm really grateful to have people in my life who've just been like, yeah, do this, don't wear that. That looks really stupid on you. No, I'm just kidding. Like people compliment my fashion, but I've had a lot of help. So yeah.
Bless you.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm aware of taking up so much of your time, but
no, it's fine.
I really want to know why Sasha.
Oh yeah. So honestly, just the main reason is just I liked how it sounded and felt. It's not really a particular story, except I tried out a few different names when I was picking a different one. I always thought my dead name was like really boring, and so I wanted something a little more interesting than that. But I also didn't want to like name myself something like, there's sort of a stereotype in the trans community of trans women naming themselves like Alice or Celeste or like these very like Final Fantasy, like sort of like fantasy or sort of like ethereal sci-fi names or whatever. There's stereotypes about trans men and non-binary people too. Like non-binary people are named after nouns like brick or leaf, or,
wow.
Stuff like that. And it's a whole thing. But I basically just was going through a couple things, didn't really find anything that I felt like would stick that I really liked. And then I was rewatching Attack on Titan, actually, and I got to there's like this, I think it's in the first episode, actually, maybe the second, but there's this girl called Potato Girl, because yeah. And they're like, it's like a boot camp kind of situation, and they're sitting there in boot camp, and she's just like munching on a potato. Well, it's a very funny reveal because like this like drill sergeant just like yelling at them. It's very like like scary, and they're all just like terrified. And then she's just like munching on a potato, it's like like a raw potato, just like, why are you doing this? And he's like so confused at like, you know, and I feel like she's so like neurodivergent coded, like, you know, like ADHD or autism or something. And like, you know, so I'm like, okay, so I saw a lot of myself in that because I've had so many examples of me just like being completely unaware of some social norm, you know, and just like oblivious to it and then sort of learning the hard way. So, you know, he's just like, why are you doing that? And she's like, because I'm hungry. And I'm like, I love that answer. Yes. And then she ends up running laps around the thing for the rest of the day. And I'm like, that sounds familiar too. So
awesome.
Yeah, so I picked Sasha to sort of commemorate one of my favorite characters. And you know, it's like a little silly, but like, I don't know, it's a good name. I like it.
I think it's absolutely brilliant. And I think it suits you down to the ground.
Thank you. Yeah, it's actually short for Alexandra.
Oh, is it? I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's like a Russian nickname, basically.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, I learned something new again.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. This has
Absolutely.
been absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, likewise.
Real pleasure.
I feel like I could talk another like 5 hours about this stuff, but I know
what?
we do have to probably wrap it up. So.
You know what? I think I will do another episode with you at some point.
Yay. Yes. All right.
Thank you so much.
Cool. Yeah, absolutely. Great talking with you.
Huge thanks to Sasha for chatting with me. I learned so much there and I hope you did too. What an amazing role model Sasha is. You can go and listen to Sasha's chosen music along with all my other guests' tracks in the playlist for this podcast, and the link is in the description. If you've got some ideas of who I could interview next, then please do send me a message. The links are all in the description. And thank you so much for listening.